They pointed and laughed as if he was the biggest fool in the territory. But in 3 days, every man who mocked Boone Carter would be begging for his forgiveness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge when the lawyer finished reading Uncle Malachi's will. Boone Carter sat in the wooden chair, his worn hat in his hands, staring at the legal document that made him the owner of a crumbling cabin 15 miles north of town. The structure hadn't been lived in for 20 years, its roof sagging and walls weathered gray by countless storms. Sterling Maddox burst into laughter, slapping his knee as he leaned against the lawyer's desk. The wealthy rancher owned half the valley and made sure everyone knew it. His polished boots and silver belt buckle caught the light streaming through the window as he shook his head in apparent disbelief. "Boy, your uncle must have really hated you," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the small office. "That old pile of rotting wood isn't worth the nails holding it together." Rufus Callahan, the town banker, adjusted his spectacles and nodded in agreement. His thin fingers drummed against the leather portfolio in his lap as he studied Boone with calculating eyes. "I'd be willing to take that burden off your hands for $50. Save you the trouble of tearing it down." Boone felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as the two men exchanged knowing glances. Through the office window, he could see other townspeople gathering outside, their faces pressed against the glass as word spread about his inheritance. A few pointed and whispered, their expressions ranging from pity to amusement. "I think I'll keep it," Boone said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sterling's laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls. "Keep it? Son, you can't even afford to fix your own horse's saddle. How you planning to make that wreck livable?" The lawyer cleared his throat and handed Boone a brass key, its surface tarnished with age. "Your uncle left specific instructions that you were to inspect the property personally before making any decisions about its future." Boone's fingers closed around the cool metal, feeling its weight in his palm. He thought about Uncle Malachi, the strange old man who had visited the family ranch only twice in Boone's lifetime. Both times, his uncle had spoken in riddles about hidden value and patient men who understood true worth. $50 is generous, Rufus pressed, pulling out a leather wallet thick with bills. "I could have the paperwork drawn up this afternoon." Outside, Clarabelle approached the window, her concerned expression visible through the dusty glass. She was the only person in town who had ever treated Boone with genuine kindness, often slipping him extra supplies when he visited her father's general store. Boone stood up slowly, the chair creaking beneath him as he rose to his full height. Sterling and Rufus watched him expectantly, their confidence evident in their relaxed postures. They seemed certain he would accept their offer and walk away from what appeared to be a worthless inheritance. But something in Uncle Malachi's final words echoed in Boone's memory, words the lawyer hadn't read aloud. Something about appearances being the greatest deception of all. As he looked at the two powerful men waiting for his answer, Boone realized that tomorrow's ride to the cabin might reveal far more than a crumbling structure. What he discovered there would change everything he thought he knew about his uncle's legacy. The ride to Uncle Malachi's cabin took Boone through territory he had never explored, winding trails that led deeper into the foothills where few settlers had ventured. His horse picked its way carefully along the rocky path as morning gave way to afternoon, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky. When the cabin finally came into view, Boone understood why everyone had laughed. The structure leaned precariously to one side, its wooden walls bleached silver by years of weather. The front porch sagged under the weight of a collapsed section of roof, and weeds grew through gaps in the floorboards. It looked exactly like what Sterling had called it, a pile of rotting wood. But as Boone dismounted and approached the front door, something caught his attention. The brass key fit perfectly into a lock that showed no signs of rust or wear, despite the cabin's apparent age. The mechanism turned smoothly, too smoothly for a building that had supposedly been abandoned for decades. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken windows. The single room contained little more than a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a narrow bed frame. Boone ran his finger along the table's surface, noting that beneath the layer of dust, the wood was solid and well-maintained. He knelt beside the fireplace and noticed something peculiar about the stone foundation. While the rest of the cabin showed clear signs of neglect, the area around the hearth had been recently disturbed. Loose mortar crumbled between several stones, and fresh scratches marked the floor nearby. A sound outside made him freeze. Hoofbeats approached at a steady pace, growing louder by the second. Boone moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. Sterling Maddox led the group, his expensive saddle gleaming in the afternoon light. Behind him rode Rufus Callahan, and a third man Boone didn't recognize, a rough-looking character with a gun belt slung low on his hips. They dismounted near Boone's horse, their conversation carrying clearly in the still air. "Told you the boy would come sniffing around," Sterling said, adjusting his gloves. "Good thing we followed him." Rufus nodded nervously, glancing toward the cabin. "You sure there's nothing here worth finding?" "Course I'm sure," Sterling replied, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Malachi was just a crazy old hermit. This place is exactly what it looks like. Worthless." The third man spat into the dirt and rested his hand on his gun. "Want me to encourage the kid to leave? Permanently?" Boone's heart pounded as he realized these men knew more about his uncle than they had let on. Their presence here wasn't coincidental, and Sterling's earlier offer suddenly seemed less like generosity and more like desperation. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to remain invisible as the men discussed their next move. Through the broken window, he could see Sterling pacing back and forth, his confident demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "No violence yet," Sterling said finally. "We handle this smart. The boy doesn't know what he's inherited, and we keep it that way." But as Boone listened to their conversation, he realized that Uncle Malachi's cabin held secrets worth killing for. The question was whether he could discover what they were before Sterling decided that patience was no longer an option. Boone held his breath as the three men approached the cabin, their boots crunching on the dry ground outside. He needed to find another way out, but the single room offered no back door or alternative exit. His only option was to remain hidden and hope they would leave without conducting a thorough search. Sterling's voice grew closer as he climbed the sagging front steps. "Check inside quick, then we head back. I want to be in town before the boy starts asking questions." The door creaked open, and Boone pressed himself deeper into the shadows beside the fireplace. Sunlight streamed across the floor as Sterling entered, followed by Rufus and the gunman. Their silhouettes filled the doorway, blocking Boone's view of his horse outside. "Place looks exactly like it did 20 years ago," Sterling muttered, kicking at a piece of broken pottery. "Malachi always was good at keeping up appearances." Rufus moved toward the table, running his fingers along its dusty surface. "You sure he never told anyone else about the location? What if the boy figures it out?" "Boy's too stupid to figure out how to tie his own boots," Sterling replied, but his tone suggested less confidence than his words. "Besides, even if he stumbles onto something, who's gonna believe him?" The gunman remained near the door, his hand resting on his weapon. "Still think we should just get rid of the problem permanently. Accidents happen out here all the time." Boone's pulse quickened as he realized how serious their threat had become. These weren't just greedy businessmen trying to cheat him out of property. They were willing to kill to protect whatever secret Uncle Malachi had left behind. Sterling walked directly past Boone's hiding spot, stopping inches from the fireplace. The old fool was clever, I'll give him that. Hiding it right under everyone's nose for 2 decades. "Hiding what?" Rufus asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "The entrance," Sterling said, kneeling beside the very stones Boone had noticed earlier. "Malachi spent 3 years building this cabin, but only one room above ground. The real structure is underneath." Boone watched in fascination as Sterling began removing the loose stones around the fireplace's base. Within minutes, he had cleared away enough material to reveal a narrow opening leading down into darkness. The space was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through, carefully concealed beneath decades of careful camouflage. "Smart old bastard built himself an underground chamber," Sterling continued, peering into the black opening. "Told everyone he was just a hermit living in a shack, but he was sitting on the richest silver vein in the territory." Rufus whistled low under his breath. "No wonder you wanted the property so bad. How much you think is down there?" "Enough to buy half the state," Sterling replied, standing up and brushing dust from his knees. "Malachi was pulling ore out of that mine for 15 years before he died. Had to be storing it somewhere safe." The gunman shifted impatiently by the door. "So why don't we just take it now? Kid's not here to stop us." Sterling shook his head. "Because we need the legal title first. Can't move that much silver without proper ownership papers, or people start asking questions. We do this right, or we all end up in prison." As the 3 men prepared to leave, Boone realized that his worthless inheritance was actually the most valuable property in the entire territory. But he also understood that Sterling would never allow him to live long enough to enjoy it. When they discovered he had been listening to their conversation, his life wouldn't be worth the dirt beneath his boots. The three men replaced the stones around the fireplace with practiced efficiency, covering their tracks as if they had done this many times before. Boone remained motionless in the shadows, barely breathing as they prepared to leave. His mind raced with the implications of what he had just learned. Uncle Malachi had been secretly mining silver for years, accumulating a fortune beneath this seemingly worthless cabin. Sterling paused at the door, scanning the room one final time. "We move fast now. I want that deed transferred by tomorrow morning, before the boy has time to think too hard about keeping this place." "What if he refuses?" Rufus asked, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "Then we make him an offer he can't refuse," the gunman said with a cold smile. "One way or another, this property changes hands tomorrow." After they left, Boone waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before emerging from his hiding place. His hands shook as he knelt beside the fireplace and began removing the stones Sterling had just replaced. The work was harder than it looked, but within an hour, he had cleared the opening once again. The entrance was narrow and dark, disappearing into the earth at a steep angle. Boone struck a match from his pocket, holding the flame near the opening. The weak light revealed rough-hewn wooden steps leading down into what appeared to be a larger chamber below. Without hesitation, he lowered himself through the opening and began his descent. The steps were solid beneath his feet, clearly built to last. As he reached the bottom, another match revealed an underground room far larger than the cabin above. Wooden support beams held up the earthen ceiling, and the walls were lined with shelves and storage areas. But what took his breath away were the bars of silver stacked along the far wall. Dozens of them, each one gleaming in the matchlight like captured moonbeams. Uncle Malachi hadn't just discovered a silver vein. He had been systematically extracting and refining the ore for years, creating a treasure that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Beside the silver, Boone found wooden crates filled with mining tools, surveying equipment, and detailed maps showing the extent of the underground vein. His uncle had documented everything, including estimates of how much silver remained unmined. The numbers were staggering, enough wealth to last several lifetimes. A leather journal sat on a wooden table near the silver bars. Boone opened it carefully, reading his uncle's meticulous handwriting by matchlight. The entries revealed years of careful planning, including detailed observations about Sterling's growing suspicions and attempts to discover the mine's location. The final entry, dated just days before Uncle Malachi's death, sent a chill down Boone's spine. "Sterling knows something. Been asking too many questions around town. If anything happens to me, hope Boone has sense enough to be careful. That silver won't do him any good if he's dead." As Boone closed the journal, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of horses returning. Sterling's voice carried clearly through the floor above, closer than before. They had come back, and this time they weren't planning to leave empty-handed. "Spread out and search everything," Sterling ordered. "Boy's horse is still here, which means he's hiding somewhere close. When we find him, we'll have ourselves a little conversation about property values." Boone extinguished his match immediately, plunging the underground chamber into complete darkness. Above him, heavy footsteps moved across the cabin floor as Sterling and his men conducted their search. Dust filtered down through the wooden planks, falling silently onto his shoulders as he pressed himself against the earthen wall. "Check every corner," Sterling's voice carried clearly through the floorboards. Boy didn't just vanish into thin air. The gunman's boots stomped directly overhead, stopping near the fireplace. "Boss, these stones look disturbed again. Fresh scratches on the floor, too." Boone's heart pounded so loudly, he feared they might hear it from above. He had been careless in his excitement, leaving obvious signs of his discovery. Now, Sterling would know that someone had accessed the hidden chamber, and it wouldn't take long to figure out who. "Smart little bastard," Sterling muttered. "He found it, didn't he?" "What do we do now?" Rufus asked, his voice tight with panic. "If he's seen what's down there, then we make sure he never tells anyone about it," the gunman replied coldly. Boone felt his way through the darkness, searching desperately for another exit. His uncle had been too clever to build a mine with only one way in and out. Somewhere in this chamber, there had to be an escape route that Sterling didn't know about. His fingers traced along the walls, feeling for any break in the stone and earth. Near the far corner, where the silver bars were stacked, his hand encountered something different. A wooden door set flush with the wall, nearly invisible in the darkness. The handle turned easily under his touch. Cool air flowed through the opening, carrying the scent of fresh earth and distant water. This wasn't just a storage chamber. It was part of a larger tunnel system that Uncle Malachi had excavated over the years. Boone grabbed the leather journal and as many silver bars as he could carry, then stepped through the doorway into complete blackness. Above him, the sound of stones being moved echoed through the chamber. Sterling had found the entrance and was clearing it for the second time that day. Within minutes, he would discover the underground room and realize that Boone had been there first. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, sloping gently downward. Boone moved as quickly as he dared, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. Behind him, he heard Sterling drop into the chamber below, followed immediately by cursing that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. "He was here," Sterling shouted. "Recent footprints in the dust, and some of the silver's missing." "How much did he take?" Rufus called down from above. "Enough to prove what this place really is," Sterling replied grimly. "Find that tunnel entrance. He can't have gone far carrying silver bars." Boone quickened his pace, knowing that his head start was measured in minutes rather than hours. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through the hillside like a snake. His uncle had been more thorough than anyone could have imagined, creating an entire underground network that connected to multiple exit points. After what felt like an eternity, Boone saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. The tunnel opened onto a rocky ledge overlooking a small creek, hidden from view by thick stands of pine trees. Uncle Malachi had positioned this exit perfectly, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. But as Boone emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, he realized his real problems were just beginning. He had evidence of Sterling's crimes and proof of the mine's value, but he was one man against 3 killers who would stop at nothing to protect their secret. Getting back to town alive would require more than luck. It would take every bit of cunning he possessed. Boone crouched behind a fallen log, catching his breath while studying the terrain below. The creek provided natural cover, but he needed to reach his horse before Sterling's men discovered the tunnel exit. The silver bars weighed heavy in his arms, solid proof of his uncle's secret mine, but they also slowed his movement considerably. Through the trees, he could hear shouts echoing from the direction of the cabin. Sterling had found the tunnel entrance and was coordinating a search of the underground passages. It wouldn't take them long to realize where the tunnel led, and then they would come after him with deadly determination. Boone made a difficult decision. He buried the silver bars beneath a distinctive rock formation near the creek, marking the location carefully in his memory. The evidence was too important to lose, but survival meant traveling light and fast. He kept only the leather journal, tucking it securely inside his shirt. The route back to his horse required crossing open ground, but Boone had grown up hunting in these hills. He knew how to move quietly through the underbrush, using every shadow and depression to remain hidden. Years of being dismissed as weak and incompetent had taught him the value of being underestimated. As he approached the cabin, he could see his horse still tied where he had left it. But Sterling's 3 mounts were positioned strategically around the building, suggesting the men were conducting a systematic search of the area. Boone would have to time his approach perfectly to avoid detection. He waited until he heard voices coming from inside the cabin again, then sprinted across the clearing in a low crouch. His horse nickered softly as he approached, but the sound was masked by Sterling's angry shouting from within the building. Boone untied the reins and was about to mount when he heard the gunman's voice much closer than expected. "Found something, boss. Fresh tracks leading toward the creek. Follow them," Sterling ordered. "And remember, we need him alive long enough to sign that deed. After that, he's your problem." Instead of fleeing immediately, Boone made another calculated decision. He led his horse quietly around to the back of the cabin, where a broken window provided a clear view of the interior. Sterling and Rufus stood near the fireplace, studying a map that showed the full extent of the tunnel system. "Your uncle was a clever man," Sterling said, apparently addressing the empty room, "but not clever enough to keep his secret forever. We know you're out there, boy, and we know what you found." Rufus nervously wiped his spectacles. What if he makes it back to town? What if he tells people about the silver? "Who's gonna believe him?" Sterling replied, but his confidence seemed forced. "Son of a failed rancher claiming he inherited the richest mine in the territory? They'll think he's lost his mind." Through the window, Boone watched Sterling roll up the map and secure it in his coat pocket. That map was crucial evidence of the tunnel system's extent and his uncle's mining operations. Without it, Boone would have difficulty proving his claims to anyone in authority. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the gunman's return. "Lost the trail at the creek, but I found where he buried something. Looks like silver bars, judging by the weight." Sterling's face darkened with fury. So he took samples. That changes everything. We can't let him reach town with evidence. Want me to ride ahead and set up an ambush? The gunman asked. Do it, Sterling replied. But make it look like an accident. Last thing we need is a murder investigation drawing attention to this area. Boone had heard enough. He mounted his horse silently and began picking his way through the trees, staying well clear of the main trail. Sterling expected him to ride directly back to town, but Boone had a different destination in mind. There was one person in Copper Ridge who might believe his story, and she might be his only hope of staying alive long enough to expose Sterling's crimes. Boone approached Copper Ridge from the east, avoiding the main road where Sterling's gunmen would be waiting. The back streets were empty in the fading daylight, most residents already inside preparing their evening meals. He tied his horse behind the general store and slipped through the rear entrance, hoping to find Clara Belle before anyone noticed his return. She was sweeping the store's wooden floors when he appeared in the doorway, her face immediately showing relief mixed with concern. Boone, thank goodness. People are saying Sterling and his men rode out after you this afternoon. They found me at the cabin, Boone said quietly, glancing toward the front windows to ensure they weren't being watched. Clara, I need your help. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true. He pulled Uncle Malachi's journal from his shirt and placed it on the counter between them. My uncle wasn't just a hermit living in that old cabin. He was mining silver underneath it for 20 years. Sterling knows about it and wants me dead so he can claim the property legally. Clara Belle opened the journal, her eyes widening as she read the detailed entries about ore extraction and accumulated wealth. This says there are hundreds of silver bars stored underground. Boone, if this is real, it's real, he interrupted. I saw them with my own eyes. But Sterling's planning to ambush me before I can tell anyone. He's got a gunman waiting on the main road, and they won't hesitate to kill me. Through the front window, Boone spotted movement in the growing darkness. 3 riders had entered the main street, their silhouettes unmistakable even in the dim light. Sterling had realized his quarry had avoided the trap and was now searching the town systematically. They're here, Boone whispered, pulling Clara Belle away from the window. She grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite her obvious fear. There's a way to stop this. My father keeps the territorial marshal's contact information in his desk. If we can get word to him about what Sterling's doing. Sterling owns half this town, Boone replied. By the time any marshal arrives, I'll be dead and buried, and he'll have legal ownership of the mine. Clara Belle moved quickly to her father's desk, retrieving a sheet of official letterhead. Then we do this different. We document everything right now, tonight. Your testimony, the journal entries, everything. I'll witness it and seal it with my father's official stamp. As she began writing rapidly, Boone kept watch through the window. Sterling had dismounted outside the saloon and was questioning people on the street. It wouldn't take long for someone to mention seeing Boone's horse behind the general store. There, Clara Belle said, finishing the document and pressing her father's official seal into the wax. This is a legal statement, attesting to your uncle's mining operation and Sterling's threats against your life. Even if something happens to you, this document will protect your claim. Boone took the sealed paper, but his attention was drawn to movement outside. Sterling was walking directly toward the general store, his hand resting on his gun. The confrontation Boone had been dreading was about to happen, but now he had something Sterling couldn't take away: legal proof of his inheritance and Sterling's criminal intentions. Stay behind the counter, Boone told Clara Belle. Whatever happens next, don't get involved. The front door opened with a sharp bang as Sterling stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Boone in the dim interior. There you are, boy. Been looking all over for you. Sterling's hand remained near his weapon as he approached, his confident smile returning now that he had cornered his prey. Time we had that conversation about selling your property. I'm thinking you'll find my new offer much more reasonable. But Boone no longer felt like the frightened young man who had sat in the lawyer's office that morning. He had Uncle Malachi's journal, legal documentation of his claims, and most importantly, he knew exactly what Sterling was really after. For the first time in his life, knowledge had given him power over the men who had always dismissed him as worthless. Sterling stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You found my uncle's little secret, didn't you? Saw all that silver sitting pretty in his underground hideaway. Boone stood his ground, the sealed document pressed firmly against his chest. Your uncle. Malachi was my blood, not yours. Blood don't mean nothing when you're too stupid to keep what's yours, Sterling snarled. That mine's been keeping me awake for 20 years, boy. Your crazy uncle thought he was so clever, but I knew he was pulling silver out of that hill. Just couldn't prove it until now. What Sterling didn't notice was the small crowd gathering outside the general store. His raised voice had attracted attention from people passing on the street, including the town's mayor and the circuit judge who happened to be visiting Copper Ridge that evening. So here's how this works, Sterling continued, pulling his gun and pointing it directly at Boone's chest. You're gonna sign over that deed to me right now, or you and this girl are gonna have a real unfortunate accident. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the doorway. Sterling spun around to find Judge Harrison standing in the entrance, flanked by Mayor Thompson and several other townspeople. The judge's face was stern as he took in the scene, Sterling holding a gun on two unarmed civilians while making threats about property and accidents. Judge Harrison, Sterling said, trying to holster his weapon casually. Just having a business discussion with young Carter here. Business discussions don't typically involve drawn firearms, the judge replied coldly, especially when they include threats of violence against witnesses. Clara Bell stepped forward, holding up the sealed document. Your Honor, I have a sworn statement detailing Mr. Sterling's attempts to illegally acquire Mr. Carter's inherited property through intimidation and threats of murder. The judge took the document and broke the seal, reading quickly while Sterling's face grew increasingly pale. According to this testimony, you've been aware of mining operations on Carter property for years and have been planning to acquire it through fraudulent means. That's all lies, Sterling protested. The boy's making up stories about some imaginary silver mine. Boone pulled Uncle Malachi's journal from his shirt and handed it to the judge. Everything's documented in here, Your Honor. 20 years of mining records, including maps showing the exact location of the silver deposits. Judge Harrison examined the journal, his eyebrows rising as he read the detailed entries. Mr. Sterling, these records indicate you've been trespassing on Carter property and conducting unauthorized surveys of his uncle's mining operation. That constitutes theft and conspiracy to defraud. The mayor stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Sterling, you've been lying to this entire town about your business dealings. How many other properties have you tried to steal through intimidation? Within an hour, Sterling and his two accomplices were in custody, charged with conspiracy, attempted robbery, and making terroristic threats. Judge Harrison had examined the silver samples Boone retrieved from his hiding place near the creek, confirming the mine's extraordinary value. 6 months later, Boone Carter owned the largest and most profitable silver mine in the territory. He had built a proper house near the original cabin site and employed half the men in Copper Ridge in his mining operations. The same people who had laughed at his inheritance now depended on him for their livelihoods. Clara Bell had accepted his proposal of marriage, and they were planning a wedding that would be the biggest celebration Copper Ridge had ever seen. Boone often stood on the hill overlooking his mine, thinking about Uncle Malachi's wisdom in disguising valuable things to look worthless. Sterling spent his days breaking rocks in the territorial prison, his vast ranch holdings sold to pay legal fees and restitution. The man who had once owned half the valley now owned nothing but regret, while the young fool he had dismissed as worthless had become the most powerful man in 3 counties. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.